Galactosemia is a severe metabolic disease that causes the accumulation of galactose in the body. In this video, I'll give you my visual mnemonic to help you remember the cause and findings of galactosemia. We'll be exploring the final frontier, boldly going where no man, woman, or fox has ever gone before. Our scene takes place on a space station and features a certain galactic fox, which you may or may not remember from a famous video game from 1993. You see, when he's not fighting crime, Galactic Fox is binging on, what else? Galactic sugar. Yeah, take a closer look at that galactic sugar here. You see, our galactic sugar is actually space ice cream. You know, the kind eaten by astronauts or unsuspecting tourists at space museums. And oddly, this galactic ice cream kind of reminds me of galactose. Yeah, it's from space, you know, which makes it galactic. And it's also a sugary treat, which makes me think of, well, sugar. Putting this together, it's easy to see why galactic sugar is a recurring symbol for galactose, the simple sugar that causes problems in this disease. And our fox has been hoarding a lot of galactic ice cream, which should help you remember that galactose accumulates in galactosemia. Patients with galactosemia have problems metabolizing galactose, which can manifest as the buildup of galactose in the blood. In fact, since the suffix emia actually describes that accumulation in blood, the name galactosemia literally translates to buildup of galactose in the blood. And speaking of having too much galactose, it seems like our galactic fox has had way too much galactose himself. In fact, he's not looking so good right now, right? So galactose is not the only thing that accumulates. Let's focus back on our main character, the galactic fox. If you've ever played Nintendo games in the 90s, you might recognize this galactic fox with a gun at his belt. Yeah, even when binging on ice cream in the middle of the night, this guy is inseparable from his gun. By the way, this galactic fox should help you remember galactose 1-phosphate. You know, galactic for galactose and a fox for phosphate or phosphate. And the gun? Well, that gun is a recurring symbol for the number 1, since gun rhymes with 1, duh. So this galactic fox with a gun should help you remember the intermediate, galactose 1-phosphate. If you've watched our previous scene on galactokinase deficiency, you would know that galactose is first metabolized into galactose 1-phosphate by the enzyme galactokinase. This galactose 1-phosphate then undergoes further metabolism downstream. In galactosemia, the first reaction is not impaired, so galactose 1-phosphate is formed normally. The defect here is actually in the reactions downstream. So galactose 1-phosphate can also build up inside cells. To remember that galactose 1-phosphate builds up, just picture our galactic fox, alright? So what's the actual downstream defect that causes all the buildup anyways? Well, notice how this guy is dressed only in his underpants. Man, eating ice cream in your underpants is like the definition of a guilty pleasure. But wait, underpants? Doesn't the word underpants make you think of UDP? That's right, it's the UDP underpants. This pair of underpants should help you remember that a defective UDP transferase, or uridyl transferase, is the major cause of galactosemia. Classic galactosemia is caused by a defect in galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase, sometimes abbreviated as GALT. This enzyme normally transfers a UDP group from glucose to galactose. This reaction functionally produces two products, glucose 1-phosphate, which feeds into the glycolytic or gluconeogenic pathways, and UDP galactose. This UDP galactose can be converted back into UDP glucose by another enzyme, 4-epimerase. There's a lot of complexity here, so here's the gist. This UDP transferase enzyme basically enables our body to turn all these galactose molecules into glucose. And as you already know, glucose is far easier to work with. Got that? So in classic galactosemia, this galactose 1-phosphate UDP transferase, or GALT, is defective. This causes the buildup of everything upstream, including galactose 1-phosphate and galactose. However, in rare cases, the 4-epimerase enzyme that regenerates UDP glucose from UDP galactose can also be defective. This leads to non-classical galactosemia, but you'll almost never see this on test day. Unless you're really gunning for that 270 plus, just remember that classic galactosemia results from a defect in UDP transferase. And if you remember from our video on galactokinase deficiency, This excess galactose is shunted down an alternative pathway, producing a third molecule symbolized by these bottles of alcohol here. Do you remember what this galactic alcohol represents? That's right, galactitol. You know, since galactitol is an alcohol. You see, excess galactose is shunted down a separate pathway catalyzed by aldose reductase, producing, you guessed it, galactitol. In normal people like you and I, almost no galactitol is produced, since aldose reductase physiologically operates at much lower levels than galactokinase and UDP transferase. However, in classic galactosemia, there's a lot of extra galactose lying around, with nowhere to go. So a lot more of it gets turned into galactitol. No wonder why our fox wasn't looking so hot earlier. Not only did he binge on ice cream, it looks like he also raided the liquor cabinet. Man, this guy really needs some help, right? Alright, let's recap the pathophysiology here. In galactosemia, a UDP transferase enzyme is defective, causing the accumulation of galactose, galactose 1-phosphate, as well as galactitol. Since galactose is found in dairy products, including breast milk, symptoms of this disease are usually seen when the infant begins breastfeeding. Cool, now let's shift gears and talk about that ice cream cart behind Galactic Fox. Yeah, this is one of those freezer carts full of ice cream you see in convenience stores. By the way, this small cart also helps me remember that galactosemia is an autosomal recessive disorder. At Pixarize, we use large dominant autos like trucks and tanks to symbolize autosomal dominant diseases. Alternatively, we use small autos like sedans and small carts to represent autosomal recessive inheritance. So this small cart here should help you remember that classic galactosemia is inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern. Next, I want you to focus on the lever of the freezer cart. You know how these freezer carts always have a latch to open the top? Well, the handle of this latch lever is shaped kind of like a liver. Yeah, that's right, it's the liver lever, a recurring symbol for hepatomegaly. Severe damage to hepatocytes occurs in galactosemia, which notably does not occur in galactokinase deficiency. The key difference between the two diseases is the accumulation of galactose 1-phosphate, or our galactic fox here. You see, excess galactose and galactitol are kinda bad, but usually don't cause severe damage to the liver. However, galactose 1-phosphate is really toxic because unlike galactose 1-phosphate cannot diffuse in and out of cells. Instead, it gets trapped inside and keeps accumulating to ultra-toxic levels. And as a major metabolic organ, the liver is the major site of damage. So hepatomegaly is a common clinical finding. Although this isn't technically correct, I like to think of this hepatomegaly as us physically being able to see the galactose 1-phosphate accumulate inside hepatocytes. Next, notice the color of Galactic Fox's fur. It's yellow, isn't it? This yellow fur is here to help you remember that galactosemia results in jaundice, or the yellowing of the skin, eyes, and mucous membranes due to accumulation of bilirubin in the body. We've already mentioned how the accumulation of galactose 1-phosphate is toxic to hepatocytes, so you can imagine how bilirubin can be released when these liver cells die. On a clinical note, galactosemia must be on your differential when you see a yellow baby, on the wards or on the boards. Just remember Galactic Fox's yellow fur, and you'll remember to think of galactosemia as a cause of neonatal jaundice. Afterwards, let's go back to our fox. Yeah, he still looks sick, doesn't he? This sick appearance should help you remember the failure to thrive seen in galactosemia. All this liver damage causes constant nausea and vomiting, poor feeding, and weight gain, all which contribute to a very sick baby, or a failure to thrive. I mean, this fox is definitely not thriving, which is not surprising, especially after consuming all this ice cream and alcohol. Next, take a look at this Galactic Fox's eyepiece. I don't know how he sees anything out of that. By the way, this eyepiece kind of reminds me of infantile cataracts. An eyepiece for cataracts? Cataracts are formed by the accumulation of galactitol in the lens of the eye. This is a clinical finding shared with galactokinase deficiency. And in both diseases, babies may fail to visually track objects or develop a social smile. To really hammer home infantile cataracts, we've also symbolized blurry vision with foggy condensation on the glass of the ice cream machine. Because that glass was cold, right? Before we move on, I also want to mention that intellectual disability can also be seen in galactosemia. I didn't make a symbol for this because I thought it was obvious. The accumulation of compounds like galactose and galactitol is toxic to all cells, including neurons in the brain. Lastly, take a look at this E-Cola machine. Yep, it's a soda machine, which goes great with our ice cream cart, right? Coincidentally, this E-Cola machine also helps me remember E. coli sepsis, a feared complication of galactosemia in neonates. Recall from pathology that an overabundance of sugar in the body can result in increased susceptibility to bacterial infection. E. coli in particular thrives on galactose, and E. coli sepsis is feared because of mortality rates approaching 90%. Just remember our E. coli machine to peg this complication for test day. So, how do you treat galactosemia? Well, there's no way to fix the enzymes involved, so we do our best to simply avoid galactose. Mainly, this comes in the form of dietary modification to exclude galactose. For infants, this would mean stopping breastfeeding and replacing with a galactose-free formula. Whew, and that's it for galactosemia. Give yourself a pat on the back, that was a long one. But this one is very high yield, so let's do a quick recap of what you should remember. Galactosemia is an autosomal recessive disorder caused by impaired ability to metabolize galactose, a simple sugar found in many dairy products. The classic cause is a defect of galactose-1-phosphate uridyl transferase, which normally converts galactose-1-phosphate to glucose-1-phosphate. This causes an accumulation of galactose, galactose-1-phosphate, and galactitol. Galactitol can cause the development of cataracts, a finding also seen in galactokinase deficiency. However, the accumulation of galactose-1-phosphate is unique to galactosemia and leads to hepatomegaly, jaundice, and failure to thrive. An important complication to look out for is the development of E. coli sepsis. And that wraps up this video in space, the final frontier. See you in the next one.